When making a hand mold, you're going to need some basic supplies: a bag of plaster, a bag of alginate, 2 buckets, a mixing stick, a pair of scissors, and a measuring cup. In the first step of mixing the alginate, I'd like to have about 8 cups of water. I put 3 cups in one bucket, 3 cups of water in another bucket, and about 2 cups in a measuring cup. That I might not use, but I like to have just in case. When mixing the bag of alginate, I like to work all of the powder down to the bottom of the bag, then I'll clip off the top of the bag, and I'll pour the contents of that bag into one of the buckets with 3 cups of water. Then I'll pour the additional 3 cups of water into that bucket with the alginate in it, and then I'll start to mix. You may have noticed that I've set a timer for about 1 minute. When you're doing this process, it's a very time-sensitive process, so you do not want it to last too long. It should take about 40 seconds to a minute, and you want to mix as quickly as you can, as hard as you can, to try to get that mixture to about maybe a thinned cottage cheese kind of a texture, which sounds nasty, but it's a good kind of a starting point. So mix it and mix it and mix it. This is where the additional cups of water come in. If it feels like it's a little too chunky, feel free to add a little bit more water to it. You don't need a whole lot. In this case, I use maybe about a quarter of a cup, maybe a half a cup of additional water to mix to kind of thin it down a little bit. Again, it should take about 1 minute total. After about 1 minute, I want to take my mixing stick and I'm going to swipe as much of that alginate off and put as much of that into the bucket as I can. You're going to need as much as you can get. And then what I also like to do is transfer the bucket to a shorter surface, in this case a stool, so that it's a little bit more comfortable when I'm resting my hands inside the bucket. Then I'm going to position my hands how I want them to look in the final piece, and I'm going to place them inside the alginate mixture. I also want to make sure that I press my hands down to the bottom of the bucket so that I can find the bottom, and then I'm going to raise my hands up just a little bit so that no part of my hands or my wrists are touching the surface of the bucket. After about 5 minutes, the alginate should have hardened around your hand, or in this case hands, and it should be safe to just ease your hand or hands out of the bucket. If you have 2 hands in, do it 1 hand at a time, gently easing your hand out of the bucket, and you should have made a hand-size hole inside of the alginate mold. The next step is pouring the plaster. For that step, you need the mold, a bucket, a bag of plaster, a pair of scissors, a mixing stick, and about 1 3/4 to 2 cups of water. This process is not as time sensitive as mixing the alginate, but you still want to make sure that you pour the plaster before the plaster hardens. To do so, I will first cut off the top of the bag of plaster, then I will pour the water in the bucket first, and then pour the entire bag of plaster in with the water. Using the mixing stick, I will mix that together until I get something about the consistency of a thinned milkshake. When pouring the plaster, you don't want to pour all the plaster in at one time. I do it in about 4 different steps. Here I just filled up about a quarter of the mold, and now I'm moving the bucket around to push that plaster throughout the entire mold, and then here I'm just going to gently tap the bucket onto the table. What that does is it pushes up all the air bubbles to the top of the surface of the plaster so they don't rest at the bottom where they would show up on your finished plaster. So there I poured about half of the way up, move the bucket around, tap it on the table. Here I could fill it up about 3/4 of the way to the top, move it around, tap it on the table, and then finally I'm going to fill it up to the top of the mold, not the top of the bucket, but the top of the mold, and then one last little tap on the table and let it sit for about a day to dry. After about a day, the plaster should be dry enough, and I'm going to go ahead and take out the extra plaster out of the extra bucket. Make sure you don't pour that down the sink. To ease the alginate out of the bucket, I'll put one hand on top of the bucket, dump it over, and use that hand to kind of guide the alginate out. Then I'll start peeling away the alginate away from the plaster. I typically like to start where the wrists are first. They're a little bit stronger, a little bit more sturdier. Then when you get to the fingers, it might be a little bit more fragile, so be careful with the finger areas. Then a little bit of cleanup, and you can kind of see your finished product.